Okay, hello everyone. It's lovely Thursday evening here in St. Louis, and I had to check my schedule for what exactly is the theme for the lecture in the evening, and it said Grandmaster preparation, prepare like a pro kind of thing, and I'm always struggling with this, but then we've discussed it with Ben, who is producer of the show, and we came up with the cool idea that what can be done, that I can look through I'm a retired chess player. I no longer play chess. Well, I do, and it's miserable. But back in the day when I used to be not bad, some opponents you play more often than the others, right? So this will be kind of a story of a lifetime about me playing again and again and again against Anton Korobov. Yeah, hopefully we all find it. We find it, well, if not educational, at least exciting. So I do not remember what was the first time that I've played my compatriot, fellow Grandmaster Anton Korobov, but we have played more than 10 very intense tournament games, and that we are not talking sometimes to be kind of a friendly draw in some silly rapid tournament or this or that. Yeah, so we've played more than 10 very competitive tournament games, and well, to give you some perspective, this was the guy who knocked me out twice from Ukraine knockout championships after me winning game 1 in both cases. So it was, in a way, it was a nemesis for me. So when I eventually won my second title of Ukraine champion, it was thanks to me beating Korobov with black, and that's the game we will be concentrating the most on. But because it says opening preparation, I will show a couple of examples from the previous years, from the ones that I've ended up losing. And yeah, my files are a little bit messed up, so I will start with this when I was white. So this is Ukraine Championship Knockout 2004, and I'm playing there as a defending champion. However, I was by no stretch of imagination a favorite because the tournament changed the format. I won a Swiss in 2003, and then in 2004 it was the first attempt at a knockout, and knockouts stayed for 3-4 years, I'm thinking. Eventually to go back to Swiss and later on to so-called superfinals, a round robin of 10 players or 12 players, whatever. Yeah, so that's the first knockout, and Ivanchuk was playing, and guess what? Ivanchuk did not win the tournament, and I think from the names that you might have heard of, Karyakin was playing back then. He was in Ukraine, and he did not win the tournament. There have been many uprising stars or stars already. Yeah, eventually it was won by Andrei Volokitin. Korobov, I think, made it all the way to the final. So it's game 1, and here I was a vivid Reti / English opening / weird move orders player. So I was playing this stuff, and here I was pretty much a trademark. I would pretty much always play this rook e1. So the problem with rook e1, if we are perfectly honest, is that black has this move knight e4, which for whatever reason my opponent did not play. It is a very solid move, and then white has a choice to transpose into one of the most boring lines of the Queen's Indian with an extra tempo rook e1, which doesn't make any difference, because guess what? Black returns to e4, and then if you search the database with the rook on f1, it is million billion games, and white goes knight h4, and it simplifies, and it's reasonably easy. Black equalizes, and the game, I mean, it was a long positional game. Here I had it somewhat prepared, but it wasn't a specific preparation. Later on it turned out that knight b to d7 is not the best. You probably should go for this setups, knight a6, c5, and then the knight eventually goes to e6. Yeah, so here It was a very, very, very intense game where eventually I've outplayed him, and maybe there will be one moment when I would like to stop. Yeah, like here, bishop g2, bishop takes, e takes was clever. And while computer holds it, it's a incredibly unpleasant position to play for black in a practical game because the bishop is like so powerful. And yeah, and I tricked him with this, and I'm a pawn up, and eventually I won quite instructive opposite colored bishops ending, which we are about to see. Yeah, I don't know, king h1 might have been a panic because yeah, like knight e2 is threatening. It's not so many, yeah, kind of not so many moves before the time control. And eventually, how did it happen that, yeah, here, yep. Right. Yeah, I did. Because I thought, surprisingly, that, yeah, I think like knight e2 and pawn moving was, so back then I was like very much calculated-based player, so calculation-based player. So I think I just thought, yeah, like I will trade the queens when I want to, and he cannot really do much about it. And it's clear from the way I was playing, it's clear that I wasn't sure like about the path to victory. And then I'm starting to kind of expand here. Yeah, and this is critical, like f5, now if he doesn't go queen e5, he's just like has to move, and d5 falls, and I think everything falls. Like if he goes queen f7, I guess queen f4 is strong, and then g5 might materialize. So f5 kind of invites queen e5. We trade here, bishop c5, a move with the tempo. Now if the knight moves, I'll simply go g5, I guess. So he is forced to go for this. And I've calculated it all till the very end and made sure that I'm winning. Because, yeah, it's like somewhat tricky because I'm one double pawn up, right? It's like almost nothing. But what I'm making sure that I will have a passed pawn on the queen side. Whenever he tries bishop b3, I will probably go b5, not a5, right? And I will have the h-pawn because I'll go f6. And guess what? The pawns that he will have, maybe he will have a, b, and I go a5, but the pawns he will have will be stopped by this bishop. And then eventually, I mean, it's like a subject for another lecture, but it was like nicely played endgame. And eventually white just wins somehow. Yeah, ba6, d3, a7, and yeah, d2. He can take, yeah, he actually did this, and he can take the h-pawn, but then the king is running. I mean, he can go check, king e5, king h4, king d6, and just win the bishop. Bishop protects the f2 pawn. So I'm like leading the match. I've done the maximum I could. I won with white, and then with black, I'm facing this, the Nimzo-Indian, and here, this is where we are talking about preparation, because I used to be a King's Indian player, and I had a couple of King's Indian games against Anton Korobov with moderate success, and then the years where the tournament's happening, I picked up the Nimzo. So now we are talking about his preparation against my Nimzo. D, c4, knight b d7, a2, a3, c takes d4, and it used to be kind of a theoretical line. A, b4, dc3, bc3, queen c7, bishop to e2. And all that was known to me, kind of. And bishop e2 is kind of a very cool pawn sacrifice. And it's somewhat shameful, but I knew the line existed. And after queen takes c3, I'm not exactly sure what the move was, but there was a game, Kramnik against Kasparov. Kasparov comfortably kind of made the drawing. So I thought, yeah, I don't really know what's going on. That's a known position, like nothing happens. And then he played this rook b1. And I've realized I do not have a specific knowledge on what I have to do. and the position is not easy. And in like 5-10 moves, I've gotten in a terrible trouble. So rook to c1, b5, and I'm up a pawn, but it's so hard to develop. b6, bishop a3 happens. Now knight c5 would be to admit that, you know, like he can win the pawn no matter what. I still do it because rook e8, knight d4 didn't look any better. Knight goes to c6. So knight to c5, knight e5, he's not even bothered to take the pawn back. Knight to e5, bishop b7, knight c4. So now he has this idea of trading the queens, confiscating the b6, so there will be equal material, and now so my knight will be pinned to the rook. Knight f to d7, queen d6, and it's such an annoying position that I can't really do anything about it. Queen g5, queen g3, and I don't think this was possible to hold. Bishop, well, he captured with the rook, rook d8. Well, it might have been that, say, I could play better, but the opening phase was a huge success for Anton. So he's gotten the position that he knew better, that offers some like really serious initiative for white. And fun fact, so that makes the match 1-1, and then next set of games we play, I won the first game in a rapid again with black. With white this time, so I'm once again leading. And then he unleashes the same line, and over here I thought I've repaired it, because I said, computer back then was recommending go knight d5, and then after c4, do not take the pawn, but go knight c3, take the bishop, go b6, and you're safe. Well, opposite colored bishops, bishop goes to b7, you're cool, you're safe. But while he came up with a brilliant concept of going bishop b2, and now if you don't take the pawn now, you will end up like in this position with white having a pair of bishops, a queen b3 and then c4. So you kind of feel forced to take, knight takes c3, and then his brilliant idea. And I believe computer back in the day would be suggesting to take here, to go b5, and white indeed has enough compensation, but truth being told, black also is not in any serious trouble, because he can play a6 one day, return the pawn, and equalize. So instead of capturing on c3, he came up with a brilliant queen c2, where I have to take, queen takes, and it is still a very tricky position to play, which I did not manage to kind of make a draw in. So that was it, and then the next, it takes us to 2008, where again Ukraine Championship is back to being a Swiss event, and I have reasonably good event. I'm not sure what my score was. It must have been +3, because I believe the winning score was +4, which is 6.5 out of 9, and I think the last game I won was the one against Korobov. So
this is 6.5 out of 9 for you.
Yeah. And so that means I have to prepare against the guy. And by that point in time, I've suffered quite a few, like, if not defeats, but very bad positions against him, because we played like different like team events and this and that. And the games I was showing were from 2004 knockout championship, and then I'm getting knocked out again in 2006 knockout championship against the same guy. Right. So I came up with the idea to kind of return to my roots and to play the King's Indian, the opening that I was kind of started with and was like really fond of, and yeah, most of my what I'm thinking kind of good games were played in a King's Indian. And strangely enough, I was lucky in this game. I don't know where this idea, this preparation comes from, but I got lucky to guess the line he will be playing And by this point in time, I do not remember, did he have a game with this particular line or how it happened? But I pretty much guessed everything up to the point when I'm having a very good position. So we'll kind of quickly go through the opening stage, and then hopefully we will discuss what happened in the game later. So, and again, so e5, castle, so far so good. And then in one of the games against Anton, I went for this line, rook e8, f3, c6, king h1, knight h5. This was a funny line, and then, okay, if I check what the book has to say, it does not, yeah, that's interesting, because it was played in Ukraine where we were both grandmasters, 2600, and still it is not in the database. It's one of those weird tournaments that is, I don't even think it was rated, like FIDE rated, but yet it featured like very strong Ukrainian players. Right, so we've played this one and it went exactly as it should. I think Topalov, was it Topalov or Jabba, was it Kasimzhanov, Topalov, something, yeah, like g4, knight back to f6, bishop f4, h5, this is kind of the gist of the line, and then knight to f5 is like very, very strong move, which was first play on the highest scene by Kasimzhanov against Topalov. And the game was the game result was a little bit confusing because it ended in a draw and people believed that there is like nothing here. But if, like nowadays, I believe the engine would just say that white is like almost winning. Back in the day, the computers were not as strong, but still, you could tell that this is something promising. And it was a little bit of analysis, human analysis. You could figure out that this is like winning. But yeah, but the first game in the database, Kasimzhanov versus Topalov, our game happened maybe a few months earlier. So I had no idea knight f5 existed. And Anton either found it over the board or possibly he knew about the line and he already had it prepared. So all I'm saying, like I was against a very, very dangerous player. So this time I went knight a6. Knight a6 is once again is one of the moves that were relatively popular there in these years, and I think the main move would be bishop e3 here. But he was playing, and I either had this information or guessed it, that he will play d5, knight c5, queen c2. That's a tricky line because it looks like black is getting what he wants to. So the knight gets to c5 and black is just in time to play a5 to stop b4. But at some point, yeah, and we will see it, h6, bishop e3, provoking h6. Then black, he doesn't have to, but it was believed that b6 is needed. The reason for that is I think after, well, the tempting move knight g4, I think bishop takes, pawn takes, and h3, kicking the knight back, and then just taking on e5 is kind of good for white. It's a tricky position still because black can take on d5, cd5, bishop e5, but to play this against a prepared opponent is something that he would not want to do. Right, so b6, knight to d2, then not very King's-Indian, but kind of a funny move, bishop g4. The reason for bishop g4 is like knight g4 runs into bishop takes, I guess. Yeah, like knight g4 runs into bishop takes, and white goes a3, and this b4 happens very quickly. So theoretically, in this type of King's-Indians, white is not supposed to exchange the light square bishop, or rather black should be very happy if he changes the light square bishop. However, the problem is that the bishop might get in trouble if I just play irrelevant move like king h7. Then after b4, I cannot drop the knight back to d7 because then the bishop is trapped, f3 and g4, or h3 and g4, right? Therefore, and yeah, of course, king h7 is not the greatest, but also you are limited with the moves. And now Then I'm looking at it, computer suggests that I have to go back all the way to c8. After b4, I have to go to d7. And you are getting this feeling that apparently black's attack with f4, with f5, f4, and so on will be too late, right? White has already gotten forward with his queenside attack. So the move was not knight g4, but bishop g4. And that was something that I kind of knew. And the point for that was that after bishop takes, knight takes, black is kind of very happy to force the exchange of the other bishop as well. Therefore, white would play f3, and there are still games in the database with this position, so it wasn't new. And somehow I guessed this one as well. b3. So now with the bishop on d7, the difference is that if white plays f2, f3 intending b4, then black can go a4. If not for the bishop there, white could have captured c5 and won a pawn. But over here, you know, a4, and black stops white's activity for a very, very long time. It's very hard to get b2, b4 in. So that means it slows down white for one more tempo. White has to go b3 to prepare a3 and stop black's idea of playing b4. Knight to h5. Now knight is headed towards f4. White goes rook f to e1, preparing to go back on f1 if knight f4 is played. And I knew all that up to bishop f6 move. And this is where, so the trick is that I do want to get this bishop on g5. That'd be very, very good outcome for me. So now kind of the usual f5, a3, f4. This is how you would attack in the King's Indian, right? f4 and then g5 and hope for knight back and g4, and so that will be very kind of standard Trafaretic, if you like, King's Indian way of playing this position. And the problem with that strangely, like for this kind of attack, the usually bad knight on e7 is actually better than quote-unquote good knight on c5, because knight from e7 goes to g6, sometimes to h4, and supports black's initiative. While over here, after g5, which ends up happening, white goes b4, and this knight has to go to either a6 or b7, and in both cases, well, computer says like you have to go to b7. In both cases, this knight will never, ever, ever take part in, you know, in the kingside attack, and therefore white is free to go knight b5. Now, if you ever take, this knight is terrible, and also you're not getting g5, g4 in. If you do not take, if you do something else like knight f6, white is first to start the action. Go c5, and black has to react on the queen side, and that means, yeah, King's Indian play pretty much failed. Right, so f5 doesn't work, but what does work is bishop f6. And bishop f6 is the pawn sacrifice, which was sort of prepared. And now it's so easy for computer to tell that if you take on f4, black is actually almost winning. But back in the day, like, computers were weaker, and computer would actually be critical of black sacrificing this pawn. So it took you, like, you know, some time to move the pieces around on a physical board, and also understanding of such positions, and in a way, like, to believe that black has enough compensation if he sacrifices the pawn. So the trick with bishop h6 is, of course, that black goes bishop g5. And this way he ensures that the bishops are traded, because if you ever attempt to take on f8, black is winning after bishop e3. Bishop e3, and then king f1, it's a forced checkmate after queen h4, knight d1, and knight to g3. And if the king was to go the other way, king f1, then black wins in quite a funny way, because now queen h4 is not as great. White will play knight f1, defend g3 and actually has chances of surviving. Instead, you go knight g3 first, and then, yeah, okay, queen h4 is not happening, but queen f8 does. Queen h6 is the big threat. After knight f1, which is literally the only way to stop a checkmate, it's queen h6, knight h2, king to g7. Black is already getting like queen h2, rook h8 vibes after g4, which stops queen h2, rook h8, and checkmate on the next move. Okay, that's like one line, and that's an understandable line, but white should not capture the rook in this position. White should capture the bishop, of course, and queen g5. But here, like, it took me quite some time to understand that black's initiative is actually quite strong. Knight f4 and f5, and sometimes you don't even need f5. You just go king g7, rook h8, and you create the threats on the h file. Well, modern computer is very helpful. It immediately says black, advantage black, -1. So black is down a pawn, but according to computer, black is up a pawn. So that means, yeah, it's tons and tons of compensation. Okay, so after bishop f6, well, Anton, rightfully so, decided not to take on h6, but then black has enough counterplay. g3, bishop to g5, bishop f2. So that was his response. I went knight to g7, and now, according to the machine, the modern machine, knight g7 is probably not the greatest move. According to the modern machine, white had to go h4, which, I don't know, possibly was the greatest move. However, rook d1 was played, f5, a3, f4. And after f4, I was reasonably sure that black has to be doing okay. It's equal for now, according to computer, but I'm guessing like those blocked Nimzo-Indian positions, even modern computers, they're very good nowadays, but sometimes even modern computers, they underestimate how like kind of long-lasting black's initiative can be. And, or like, you know, like a very, very long plan of attacking the king. So what's happening, first things first, g4 is not great. g4, well, black has bishop h4, which is very standard, but there is also a fun move suggested by Engine to go a4, after b4, go knight b3, and when everything is traded on b3, only then you start attacking. So there is no queen on the second rank. If white goes h3, it tries to keep it up, then hg, hg, bishop h4, trade the bishops, queen goes to h4. Like, black is so much faster for one pawn only. So he decided not to go g4, but he will not have a second chance. King to g2, and black went h5. So now there is no g4, right? And he's going rook h1, and rook h1 is played with the intention to go h4. I went queen to c8. So now intending bishop h3, and now what Anton had to do, I believe, is still to play h4 and somehow continue from here. It's not the greatest of positions. It is very complex, but if he plays h4, he makes sure that the knight on g7 is misplaced. And yeah, so the whole preparation was up to this bishop f6 pawn sacrifice, and I've looked into it a little bit, and I believe even like knight g7 connected with f5 was on a table, maybe, on the board, analysis board that is. But yeah, now modern computer, of course, criticizes the game that played like 15 plus years, 15 and a half years ago, I believe. Right, so, and after queen c8, this is where he made a very, very serious mistake. And serious mistake is natural looking move b4. Eventually, white decides that he also has some trumps on the queen side and wants to push the pawns forward. So a takes, bishop h3 check. And this bishop h3 check is very important because otherwise like moving the knight to b7 or a6, once again, I'm attacking the king side and one of my pieces will be cut off. So I went bishop h3 and knight d7. Knight to b5, knight to e8, and knight to e8 is played because I, well, want to defend this thing for now, so that in case of bishop f1, I will be able to go knight f6. And in case of bishop h3, I'd be able to sub the bishop for the queen. So there will be a queen on h3. Knight e8, knight goes to b1. I guess planning to support the knight on b5 with knight on c3, also clearing the second rank for the queen. Knight d to f6 nonetheless. Knight goes to c3, rook f7, queen d3. Well, here I'm not sure. I went back to g7. Bishop f1. Bishop takes, queen d7. So now what happens, white achieved the exchange of the light square bishops, and it might seem that he's okay, but now, well, white is nowhere near to come up with anything decisive on the queen side. So the king side pressure, and I'm ready to bring the other rook to f8, the king side pressure is very important, and that means that the knight on b5 is sort of out of play, because it's all about this tension on the king side. And then black knight on g7 is awkward for now, but black will be able to bring all the pieces into the game and maybe sacrifice something. While white's both knights are somewhat away, and specifically the b5 knight. Also, the rook on h1 is currently not the greatest. Queen g2, rook f8, and then my opponent couldn't wait any longer, and he decided to go h3 and make me. So after h3, I'm forced to take a decision. After h3, I'm forced to take a decision. And, well, decisions, perhaps the only decision I can take here is to take on g3, because otherwise, like if I do something slower, white is ready to play g4 to shut the play down, and he will be the one who is better. So I'm taking on g3, bishop g3, knight to h7, and yeah, like h2, h3 is a mistake, but we have to understand it's one of the last rounds of a very, very strong Swiss tournament. We are both kind of in a must-win situation pretty much, and we are also getting somewhat tired, and it's a lot of tension. And something I didn't mention at the very end, at the very beginning, like every game with Anton, be it like me winning, me losing, sometimes it'd be like some draw, it would last for very long, and we would be both exhausted after the game. So somehow, strangely, like, you know, there are such opponents that you just require all the effort, all the energy that you have. h3, f takes g3 happen, bishop takes g3, knight to h7. So now I'm playing on the f file. f3 is hanging, and again, it's clear when the f file got opened. So these knights are a little bit far away from kind of the real action. Yeah, none of it can defend the f3 pawn. So rook d3 is a must. And I'm figuring out the way to bring this knight into a conversation. I go h4, bishop f2, knight goes to h5. Now, knight f4 is a serious threat, but my opponent goes queen g4, and this is what he was pinning his hopes to. Queen g4, and we both he was going for it, and in a way I believed him that trading the queens kind of reduces my potential for an attack massively. And preparing for this lecture, I checked with the modern computer, and it says, you know what, you could have traded, went knight f4, and after rook d1, black goes bishop d8, black goes knight g5, and black is just winning. And it's not that easy to kind of fully comprehend, but like when you stare at this position long enough, you understand that it is actually true. And some ironic lines like rook to f1, for instance, like you can go among other things, you can go knight h3 and rook takes f3. And white pieces do not have moves. Yeah, well, the rook on h4 is arrested. The knight on c3 is hanging, so this knight cannot take c7. And if you move the c3 knight to, say, d1 or whatever, then guess what? Knight f4, king goes, and then, I don't even know. Knight e4 seems good. Rook d3 seems good, yeah. Black was just winning. But I went to d8, which is still better for black, because knight f4 is still a very serious threat. King f1, knight to f4, rook d1, bishop e7. So now the knight joins from g5. King e1, knight to g5. White is trying to run away with the king, and interestingly, yeah, it feels like I will be winning the f3 pawn or something, but if white king is on b3 in the current position, the fact that I win the pawn might not matter all that much, because, yeah, it's the white king which is like the main object of my attack, my initiative. Otherwise, like, imagine white king on b3. All of a sudden, the g file works in white's favor. All of a sudden, my h4 pawn might be weak. So I have a very, very limited time window to kind of surround this king and, yeah, come up with something decisive. So knight g5, I was very happy when I found knight g5, because after bishop h4, I come up with, well, it's not as complex as one would think, but still a nice double knight sacrifice. So it was knight f3, queen f3, and then bishop h4 is good, but I thought it would be even funnier to go knight g2. Knight g2, you have to take with the queen, and after bishop h4, white loses the queen. Rook f2, queen f2, rook f2, king to d3. And here it's clear that, like, pattern-based play, the King's Indian long-term initiative is over. There is nothing, it has nothing to do with the preparation, but the game is still kind of tense, interestingly, especially taking into account the tournament situation that, like, yeah, I'm playing for a win. I feel like I'm very much there, right? My position should be winning. But it's been instances when I couldn't convert, and same, like, it would strangely go both ways in our games. That sometimes he would struggle to convert, like, a great advantage, and, like, eventually would let it slip and maybe even lose, and I would do the same. So it was like, you know, you want to be extra cautious, but also you don't want to spend too much time. Anyway, so when queen f8, c5, yeah, queen f8, and yeah, and what's annoying against, well, playing against Anton, and I don't know, maybe someone from kind of stronger players who got the chance to play against him will listen. So you can beat him, but it's never easy. He keeps finding resources, because after queen f8, you know, queen f3 is a threat, and very often you would expect, okay, I mean, perhaps the game is over, perhaps my opponent is resigning. But now he actually goes c5, pawn takes, queen to c5, rook f1. And then say, if you trade on f1, you probably are winning, but it will take you an awful lot of time to win this one, right? So we can potentially see how, I don't know, rook on f3 defends the h3 pawn, these knights somehow block the pawn. I don't know. So I wanted something bigger, and I had to find one last bit of tactic. So rook h2, rook f3, bishop to g5. So now rook d2 is a checkmate, so this rook cannot move. And after rook to g3, the winning move, which I'm sure would we have a live audience, somebody would find, is queen to f2. And it might seem to be a bit confusing, because after rook g5, how exactly do we win? After queen f3, the king goes to c4. And same happens after queen c2, king c4. So the winning move after rook takes would be rook to h3, and after king c4, surprisingly, black queen returns to c5, where it just was, forcing the king to b3, and now this knight is pinned, which allows black to capture the other knight. So this would be an easy win, right? And I don't even know what like I guess queen c4 is good enough, and computer might come up with something even better, but queen c4 seems good enough winning the knight. So queen to f2, rook d to g1, and rook takes h3, and this was the end of it. Like once again, it's a cross. Kind of rook is pinned after rook h3, winning yet another pawn, and I'm threatening queen f1, which means the c7 pawn cannot be taken, and this is where my opponent resigned. So that was a very, very, very memorable game, and in terms of like emotions that I had after the game I won, it was probably the very peak. And it's before my highest rating in my career. It's before like some really good results, but that was something. And after that, I think he won a couple of games in very, very prestigious events against me. Of course, those would include Ukraine championships, and so that was like the last clear game that I won against the guy. I think the score is still equal, and since I'm retired, he has very little chance to, to turn it into his favor. But a brilliant player, and I'm very happy to have played such game against him. And that's it, I guess. So sometimes, well, the takeaway is it'll be very clumsy, but sometimes, let's say you change the opening repertoire and you're struggling against particular players, and it happened to me quite a few times, and I've realized that sometimes, like, something the best, something you feel the position. The thing with my relationship with King's Indian defense is that, not knowing the theory in many lines, I'd be able to find the moves simply because, like, you understand these positions as like vague, as like undefining as it sounds, right? So this could be a piece of advice that, like, if you face the same opponent and you've tried various openings against him, then maybe kind of preparing something from your old beloved lines could work for me. So I think that will be it. Well, thank you.